Thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to begin just a few questions and then yield to my distinguished colleagues. Let me ask you, first of all, what African countries have prioritized electrification? If you could just go through some of those countries and what some of the obstacles and challenges that we and others are facing in trying to assist. Are the U.S. and other investments meeting the challenge, or are there gaps? Has enough been allocated to this endeavor to make it happen sooner rather than later? Operationally, is the emphasis on national governments or state governments, or both and local? If you find a national government that's unwilling to be as transparent as we would want them to be, do we look to bypass and go to a state? Because obviously in the U.S. it is the states and local governments that carry the heavy burden of providing electricity. Is that model being replicated in Africa? In terms of the electrification, obviously we have state-of-the-art electrification here, and I have visited virtually every electricity plant in my state, most of them, not all of them, over the years. And they obviously have many environmental safeguards, scrubbers when it's coal, to ensure that what comes out the chimney does not lead to disasters health-wise because of pollution. Are those kinds of environmental sustainable best practices being incorporated in what we do? It seems to me there's so much on-the-shelf capability and knowledge that it would be a shame if that was lost. If you could just spend a moment on that as well. How are and where are the African power leaders, especially the equivalent to the NCO Corps, the people who actually run the generators, and where do they get their education? Are they partnering with electricity companies here? Or, is it something that they're picking up in college, junior college? Who is training those who will run the plants so that they will be run safely and effectively? And finally, the Beyond the Grid initiative under Power Africa is intended to facilitate investment in small-scale energy solutions. Do you think such projects could interest more African entrepreneurs to take a greater interest in creating means to supply energy to underserved communities in Africa? If you could speak to those questions, I would appreciate it.
Thank you for your questions, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this entire topic and introducing the legislation. So each country is in a different place, but we've seen a number of countries really focus on increasing electrification. And you see this, for example, as witnessed in the MCC compacts in Tanzania and Ghana. Both governments have realized that the lack of electricity is holding back their growth. And there are a number, I won't go through the whole list, but there are a lot of countries realizing how important this is to their growth, to their healthcare system, to their education system, and are looking to really do a lot more in this area. There are gaps, and that's part of the concept behind Power Africa, is to identify what the gaps are and work with the governments and the private sector investors to try to solve them. We have seen cases where private sector investors from the United States and elsewhere have tried to do deals, and then they run into a roadblock. And that's where the transaction advisors step in and say, okay, how do we solve that?
On the gaps issue, is that something you could summarize and provide to the subcommittee, so we get a sense of what you are truly encountering?
Yes, we can.
And then we could try to be helpful with those governments. And
we can do that. In terms of local and national governance, obviously there are often national policies that set the energy policy and the tariffs for an entire country, but there are a number of local aspects that also come to play, and we work with all of them in the same roadblock approach to figure out what are the challenges and how do we deal with that. The question of environmental and social safeguards is very important, and you're absolutely right. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to make sure that we use state of the art, and so all the projects, for instance, if there's a component that involves the development banks, each one of those banks has their own policy for checking these things and working with the governments and making sure that the projects fit those standards and don't introduce some really poor practices. In terms of the education and training, there are local institutions that offer, in some countries, training. In other cases, people have education from the United States or Europe, but it is an area where there are shortfalls. There's actually a long-standing partnership that USAID funds, which involves a lot of U.S. utilities, and another one involving U.S. regulators, and they work in combination with people in the individual countries for this very reason, so that they can have very technical interactions from one utility technical person to another, and to try to increase that skill level, because there are definitely gaps, and we need to keep working on that. Similarly,
on that point, if I could, do those technical people come here to learn, or do our people get deployed there?
both.
Oh, both.
Depending on the circumstances.
How
But
large of an operation is that?
It's a modest-sized, very economical system where each year we get requests from different countries, and it's not restricted to Africa, but Africa has been a big participant. And then we look at them and we match them up with different utilities. I don't know off the top of my head, but probably a utility in New Jersey or in some California utilities or whatever. But they match them up with utilities that have the expertise that they need. And then they have these exchanges and interactions.
Mr. Posa, for the record, could you provide the committee a sense of what that is, maybe a
Yes, we
summary?
can.
That would be very helpful.
Yes, we can. And then lastly, before I turn to my colleagues, absolutely on Beyond the Grid, having local organizations and entrepreneurs seeing the business opportunities is part of the objectives. And that's sometimes where some of the credit guarantees of OPIC or USAID or others can help them deal with the risks and introduce them to interesting business opportunities, which they know very well, because some of these remote areas they might know much better than a large company. But I'm sure on several of these points my colleagues have things to add.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman Smith, I would add a couple of points, if I may. First of all, I mean, we all, I think, acknowledge the difficulty of providing broad answers because of the very great diversity of the different circumstances in different African countries, and indeed rural versus urban settings. But within that, with that danger, I'll attempt to respond. In regard to the question about cutting-edge development of the power systems, the grid centralized systems, one of the areas that we felt is very, very important, and that a number of our agencies have worked on from different vantage points, different perspectives of our respective missions, is the business of utilization of associated gas from oil development projects. The historical experience of the flaring of natural gas is understandable when infrastructure is lacking, but when infrastructure manages to be lacking then for protracted periods of time into decades, then that's really a critical lost opportunity. And so one of the things that we have been focusing on in our policy dialogues with African countries, and indeed one of the things that we're focusing on at the level of identification of mutual interest between U.S. companies and opportunities in certain African countries is this area of gas capture for power generation. Together with the Trade and Development Agency this summer, the Department of Energy organized a reverse trade mission that took leaders from a couple of different African countries to the Houston, Texas area for a series of meetings with companies involved in gas development, gas sector development. So we think that there's an area for potential opportunity there. In regard to the Beyond the Grid initiative and some of the potential for growth with African entrepreneurs, from the Department of Energy perspective, one aspect of this that we have been focusing on is the importance of proper performance of products in the marketplace. So it is, of course, easy to spoil the market when you have substandard products, be they for off-grid or for solar lanterns, another area where Department of Energy has worked. And so we are working with our colleagues at AID in particular to look at this question of how to make sure that off-grid lighting systems and solar systems and hybrid systems that are a mix of renewables and either diesel or natural gas, that they actually perform in the way that is advertised, so that then you see a healthy development of that entrepreneurial opportunity going forward. Lastly, on the issue of the training, I would say from our perspective, this is an area that is both of huge interest to U.S. companies, but it's also, in terms of gaps, I mean, lots of, shall we say, headroom, opportunity for growth. I'm sure that members of the committee have had the experience, as I and my colleagues have, for example, as a comparison, of traveling throughout the Gulf region, and when one is in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates or Kuwait, many other countries where there have been historical, very long-lasting education and training and company relationships, what that translates into is not only high-quality energy development, it also translates into huge opportunity for U.S. companies, because in many cases, our counterparts are familiar with U.S. standards, U.S. approaches, U.S. vendors. So huge opportunity for growth there. It's an area that DOE is looking to try to develop some ideas on. Thank you.
May I make a few
yes, Dr.
points? I have 5 points that I'll chime in here on that relate to the gaps and challenges. The first is, in a sense, I think a common problem throughout the subcontinent is related to the financial position of the utilities. So, in a sense, one of the challenges is how to strengthen the regulatory environment, the pricing environment, and move toward more commercial utilities, because then the investors will then know that they have a credible off-taker for the power that they're generating. Clearly, we've done a lot of work through Power Africa on power purchase agreements, developing standardized approaches. OPIC has been very active in this area, and that's very important. At the same time, though, you need to have a solvent, financially viable energy system in order to have the long-term investment that's necessary to develop the sector. Second is, I think, Mr. Elkine's point about the integration of gas and the upstream issues with the power sector is a particularly important challenge. Oftentimes you have different ministries, like in Nigeria, and you've got to, in a sense, try to work to help them, be a catalyst for them, at least to try to do better planning so that you can ensure that the oil and gas that's being developed in the country is going to be available to meet the needs of the countries. Ghana is a very interesting example where they want to develop a lot of capacity, and yet the oil and gas development has been slow in coming. The point about urban and subnational, I think, is a very important point in Africa as well as in other regions, because the urbanization process is creating these centers of buildings and industry, and the mayors and the subnational leaders of those entities are becoming more and more important as this process goes. And as you know, we haven't talked about urbanization, but urbanization is still at a really embryonic stage in sub-Saharan Africa with less than 50%, and it's even by 2030, you're only going to have 54% urban. So there's a lot, but it's rapidly growing, and that working with the cities and the urban areas is a very important area, particularly in areas like energy efficiency. Fourth area is the entrepreneurial development in local institutions. Here, I think in many cases, it's very important to work with the local business community, which we are, and also to focus on how can we develop more capacity and receptivity in the local banking system so that they can lend for some of these projects, so it isn't just dependent on international capital coming in, because you know that much of the international capital, particularly the private and venture capital, institutional capital, sees huge risk and are very risk averse in terms of coming into a lot of these areas. So the local banking sector becomes very important. And we've seen in Nigeria and some of the other countries that the local banking system can, if developed, play a key role. And then finally, I would say that there are a lot of actors that are playing in this field. I think it's very important, and we are, of course, working very closely with the World Bank and African Development Bank and other donors to try to have a coordinated approach that addresses the range of gaps institutionally and otherwise, and that we're trying to leverage our money effectively in that process.
Dr. Eichhorn, thank you very much. Ms. Bass.